terrifying new technological age. With this horrifying demonstration of the destructive potential of thermonuclear weapons, the species itself now possessed the technology required to commit autogenocide. But Ivy Mike was never really designed to be a deliverable weapon, and although a number of weapons were jury-rigged together, called the Mark 16 nuclear bomb, these were immensely impractical. Somehow, a solid fusion fuel had to be developed in order to allow for the deployment of practical, deliverable thermonuclear weapons. An answer was found in the chemical element lithium. It was well known that when the isotope lithium-6 is hit with a neutron, it can undergo fission. It is the only light element which can do so, but the energy released in this process is much smaller than uranium. But of more interest is lithium-6's fission products, helium and tritium. The ability to create tritium by exposing lithium-6 to the intense neutron radiation of a fission bomb detonation was the key breakthrough in hydrogen bomb design. All that was required to sustain fusion was deuterium, which was simply chemically bonded to the lithium atom to create lithium deuteride. Much like lithium hydride, lithium deuteride is a stable, inert, inorganic solid at room temperature. It has a melting point of nearly 700 degrees Celsius and is not radioactive. Just as black powder contains everything required for a deflagration in a single, stable solid, both the oxidizer and the fuel, so had Teller's team forged a fuel that contained deuterium and tritium in a solid, inert form. The first test of a solid fuel thermonuclear device was set for March 1st, 1951. Codenamed Castle Bravo, the shot would be detonated at the Pacific Proving Ground on Bikini Atoll. The device itself, called the Shrimp, was much smaller than the Ivy Mike design. It weighed just over 10 tons. The fission primary was a variant of the compact Mark 7 bomb, which, when boosted, produced a yield of 60 kilotons. The secondary was formed by a cylinder of lithium deuteride, containing both a fission spark plug at the center and a natural uranium tamper surrounding the fusion fuel. The spark plug was a critical element in achieving a good fusion burn. Essentially a rod of weapons-grade plutonium, as this underwent compression, it would become critical, creating a fission explosion within the fusion fuel. This would act as a source of internal pressure, compressing the fuel against the imploding tamper and showering the lithium with high-energy neutrons. This whole assembly was housed in a radiation case, a 1-inch thick solid aluminium cylinder. The radiation case was designed to reflect the initial burst of X-rays, confining it for as long as possible and directing its energy towards the fusion secondary. The space between the primary and secondary was filled with a form of polystyrene foam, which would instantly turn into a low-Z plasma, allowing for a smooth transfer medium for the X-ray radiation. The yield of the weapon was designed to be about 5 megatons. However, Castle Bravo seriously overperformed. Lithium has two stable isotopes, lithium-6 and lithium-7. Lithium-7 is by far the most common on Earth, and it made up about 60% of the lithium in the fuel. Under normal circumstances, when hit with a neutron, a lithium-7 atom will absorb it and decay into beryllium-8, adding nothing to the reaction. What no one knew at the time was that when hit by neutrons with the kind of energies present in a nuclear detonation, lithium-7 will also undergo fission, producing both tritium and neutrons. This caused a cascade of effects. As the lithium-7 as well as the lithium-6 began to produce tritium, the total amount of fusion reactions more than doubled, greatly increasing the amount of energy released. Additionally, the higher neutron flux caused by the fission of the lithium-7 and the additional fusion reactions bombarded the uranium tamper with far more neutrons than expected, which led to much more fission. In all, these processes generated a yield of 15 megatons, quite literally 1,000 times as powerful as the little boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima. As soon as the device was detonated, the control crew knew something went wrong. The shot was fired from a concrete bunker located on NEU Island at the other end of the atoll, some 38 kilometers away. When the ground shock hit, it was so powerful that standing was impossible. As a result of the overpressure, water surged out of the toilet and behind the control panel. The fireball was unimaginably huge, measured at some 7 kilometers in diameter. It was so bright that it was instantly visible on neighbouring Rongelap Atoll. On board the Japanese trawler Fukuyuru Maru, one of the sailors remarked that the sun rises in the west. Around the control bunker, all above-ground buildings had been flattened by the blast wave. As onlookers on board the Navy Task Force watched, the colossal mushroom cloud rose rapidly into the sky, ballooning to over 100 kilometers in diameter. Soon it began to snow. With tiny white flakes of ash raining down on them and Geiger counters rapidly clicking, the task force steamed south at full speed. Castle Bravo was a particularly dirty bomb, producing extremely high levels of fallout. For reasons that will be described later, the combination of high levels of fission in the uranium tamper and sea level detonation generated a massive and deadly fallout plume. This was complicated by a misreading of high level winds. In the control bunker, the scientific team led by Dr. Felt soon began to detect an alarmingly rapid increase in radiation levels outside. As the radioactive ash began to fall around them like a heavy snowfall, radiation levels inside the bunker began to rise. Despite being in a concrete building, the team was forced to move from room to room to find one with safe radiation levels. They were all forced to cram into a data processing room that happened to have a large amount of sand above it. About 12 hours later, once the outdoor radiation levels had dropped significantly, the team were rescued by a helicopter. None received a dangerous level of radiation exposure. About an hour after the blast, radiation levels were so high that anyone outside would have received a fatal dose. As the deadly cloud was blown to the east, the Japanese fishermen on board Fukuyuru Maru had no idea of the dangerous situation they were now in. Blanketed by fallout, all received a dangerous dose of radiation, inducing burns and radiation sickness. One sailor died. The test forced the evacuation of several neighbouring atolls. Despite the dangerous overperformance of the device, Castle Bravo was a foundational step in thermonuclear weapon development. Not only was a solid-fueled hydrogen bomb now technologically demonstrated, but the possibility of using the much more common lithium-7 isotope as a fusion fuel had been discovered, something that would have remained a mystery without a full-scale test. Within months, the United States had fielded a number of operational, multi-megaton thermonuclear devices, beginning with the Mark 17 and Mark 24 freefall bombs, the latter of which demonstrated a yield of just over 13 megatons. Despite its high yield, the Mark 24 weighed a colossal 19 tons, severely complicating delivery. Essentially, only the American super heavy bombers could employ the weapon. The American family tree of super hydrogen bombs reached its apogee with the B-41. A three-stage weapon, the 10-ton B-41 had a maximum yield of 25 megatons, almost twice the energy achieved by Castle Bravo. The weapon entered service in 1963. As much as the Americans had been the pioneers of hydrogen bomb development, it was the Soviets who took the super-yield thermonuclear weapon to its zenith. Castle Bravo was a two-stage device, meaning a boosted fission primary bomb was used to compress a fusion secondary stage. This is the foundational design for all thermonuclear weapons. Nevertheless, there is no reason why you cannot add a third stage for even more yield. In a three-stage design, a fission primary compresses the fusion secondary, which then compresses another fusion stage. This design was realized in Project 202, which had a stated objective of developing a deliverable nuclear device with a yield of 100 megatons. This device was known to its developers as the Tsar Bomba, or the Emperor of Bombs. Tsar Bomba had three stages. The first was a fission bomb. The second stage actually contained a pair of small fusion charges which were placed around the massive tertiary stage. Given how large the third stage was, more energy was required to compress it to the requisite temperatures than the fission primary could provide. The second stage, by itself, had a yield of around 1.5 megatons. The detonation of the two secondary stages would provide so much radiation pressure that this would ignite the massive third stage. Lithium deuteride was also used as a solid fuel. Tsar Bomba had two yield settings depending on the configuration of the third stage tamper. If this tamper were made of lead or another nuclear passive material, the yield would be about 50 megatons. However, if the third stage's tamper was replaced with uranium-238, the yield was predicted to double. It was decided to test the device in 1961. Because of the potential for massive radioactive fallout, the lower yield configuration was selected. In any case, the possibility of the delivery aircraft escaping a 100 megaton detonation was questionable. The most remarkable thing about Tsar Bomba was the fact that it was air deliverable. Just. In order to fit the 27-ton device, the Tupolev Tu-95 had to have its bomb bay doors and fuselage tanks removed. Still, this feat stands testament to the skill and ingenuity of Soviet engineering. On October 17, the aircraft took off from its base on the Kola Peninsula and headed for the Arctic island of Novaya Zemlya. After slowly climbing to an altitude of 34,000 feet, by 11:20, the target area came into view. When released from the bomber, the weapon deployed a large parachute, a necessity if the crew were to have any chance of survival. At 11:13, at a height of 4,000 meters, detonation was initiated. Instantly, a 5-mile wide fireball lit up the morning sky. The blast wave was so powerful that it circled the Earth 3 times. Severny, an uninhabited village, was flattened by the blast wave. It was 55 kilometers from ground zero. The device produced so much thermal radiation that it would have inflicted third-degree burns on any exposed individual at a range of 100 kilometers. Despite the colossal yield of the weapon and the gigantic 95-kilometer wide mushroom cloud, radioactive fallout was minimal. In fact, radiation levels were so low that within just 2 hours of the blast, test crew were able to walk around ground zero. This low radioactive impact and the marked difference to Castle Bravo are due to both the low levels of fission in the weapon and the use of an airburst. These effects will be addressed in greater detail later. As impressive as these mega hydrogen bombs are, they really were not all that useful. Tsar Bomba was never a practical weapon of war. Even the American 25 megaton B-41, which was the most efficient nuclear bomb in history when mass and yield are considered, weighed some 4,500 kilograms. Realistically, a 10 plus megaton explosion is really overkill for virtually all situations in which one might want to use a nuclear weapon, and the costs you pay in mass and its impact on delivery systems are substantial. Most of these super hydrogen bombs had short service lives. Thus, in the late 1960s and 1970s, the emphasis of nuclear weapon design changed substantially. It was realized that if you could use a thermonuclear reaction to make large bombs unfathomably powerful, you could also use the same technology to make nuclear weapons much smaller and lighter, while still having very significant yields. For example, the Mark 13 bomb, a fission weapon, provided a yield of 30 kilotons. It weighed just under 3,000 kilograms, or 6,600 pounds. But by utilizing the additional yield generated by a thermonuclear reaction, the W-58 warhead had an estimated yield of 200 kilotons, despite weighing just 117 kilograms, or 257 pounds, about as heavy as a large man. The W-58 was just 1 meter in length. This miniaturization meant that many more weapons could be delivered by a single system. But it wasn't just thermonuclear weapons that underwent a process of miniaturization. Within the first 5 years of nuclear weapon development, much smaller yield devices were produced. For example, the very early Mark IV bomb, which still used much of Fat Man's fundamental design, had several low-yield variants, including 1 and 8 kilotons. This lower yield was achieved by utilizing a smaller plutonium pit. Both the Soviets and Americans quickly realized the limitations of high-yield weapons in battlefield applications. When using a nuclear device tactically, meaning targeting an enemy's military forces whilst they are deployed, and therefore actually in the battle space, lower yield weapons are far more useful. Even 20 or 30 kilotons may pose significant risks of not only collateral damage to nearby civilian infrastructure and population, but your own forces. The thing about battle is typically friendly formations will be operating in close proximity to the enemy, making a 1 megaton weapon essentially useless. This led to a divide between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. In simple terms, tactical weapons are designed to be used on the battlefield to engage military targets in close proximity to your own forces. They are designed to win battles. strategic nuclear weapons were designed to destroy your enemy's ability to wage war itself, either by destroying their critical military infrastructure in their home area, or, at the most extreme case, by striking their population centres and economic assets. In the early to mid-Cold War, tactical nuclear weapons were, generally speaking, smaller, lighter devices with a yield that was less than 20 or 30 kilotons. Although when defining a nuclear weapon as tactical or strategic, there is no hard line when it comes to yield. Some weapons can serve in both roles. What really makes tactical weapons different is their method of delivery. Modern battle is fluid. Opportunities for the employment of a nuclear weapon on the battlefield may be fleeting. As an example, as a NATO corps commander, you may only have an hour or two's warning that a Soviet armoured division has concentrated its forces for an attack. Therefore, these small, light weapons with low enough yield that they can safely be employed in close proximity to your own forces need to be delivered by systems that are flexible and responsive. ICBMs, generally speaking, are not great delivery systems for tactical weapons because of the complex command and control arrangements. That makes platforms like tactical fighters, short-range ballistic missiles and artillery perfect delivery systems for tactical nuclear weapons. The most famous tactical nuclear weapon is probably Atomic Annie, an 11-inch artillery system that fired a 15-kiloton warhead. Tested during Operation Upshot Knothole Grable, Annie produced some of the most iconic nuclear technology ever made. Once you imagine the possibility of a tactical nuclear war, where both sides refrain from striking each other's major cities or critical infrastructure, then the utility of nuclear weapons on the battlefield becomes readily apparent. Because of their very large area of effect in comparison to conventional explosives, even low-yield nuclear weapons can be of great utility simply by improving the accuracy of your systems, or rather, by mitigating a lack of accuracy. Obviously, the impact of a 10 or 15 kiloton blast on a land battle is not hard to appreciate, but nuclear weapons are just as useful in air or naval battle. Take submarine warfare as an example. If you have detected a submarine but you have not been able to fix or track it, and you know it's there but you don't know exactly where it is, you can't engage it effectively with conventional weapons. But if you have a nuclear depth charge, like the 10 kiloton W-44 nuclear ASROC, you will likely sink any submarine in a 3,000 meter radius. The same principle applies to surface-to-air missiles. Hitting a high-flying bomber is difficult with 1960s era technology, especially considering their defensive electronic warfare capability. Now imagine trying to stop dozens of them, all of which may be carrying nuclear weapons. Well, if you equip your Nike Hercules with a 20 kiloton nuclear warhead, you only have to get a single missile within 1,000 meters of the formation. Perhaps the most iconic tactical nuclear weapon was the M28 Davy Crockett weapon system, one of the smallest nuclear weapons ever fielded. Essentially a nuclear recoilless rifle, the Davy Crockett had a range of about 2 miles or 3 kilometers. It fired the M388 nuclear round. The warhead weighed just 34 kilograms. It was about the size of a large briefcase or watermelon. A pure fission weapon, when detonated, the M388 provided a yield of 22 tons of TNT equivalent. As with all low-yield nuclear weapons, for reasons that will be discussed later, the bomb's radiation was its most lethal feature, specifically its neutron flux. All personnel within a 150-meter radius would have become instant radiation casualties, with most dying within a period of minutes. Outside of that lethal radius, radiation casualties would reduce with distance, although many within 200 meters would have died later from radiation exposure. Blast effects would have been substantial over a 100-meter radius. The weapon was designed to be used in key defensive areas such as the Fulda Gap. Davy Crockett batteries would saturate these natural choke points with small nuclear blasts, creating a radioactive barrier through which Soviet forces would have to pass. The miniaturization of nuclear weapons, which was the prevalent trend throughout the last half of the Cold War, also led to the development of variable yield devices. Commonly called dial-a-yield, this feature allows the user to drastically change the explosive power of the weapon with the mere flick of a switch. The second generation of nuclear weapons, such as the Mark IV, also had multiple different yields, but these were determined by the size of the plutonium pit that was physically placed in the bomb prior to delivery. But the development of small thermonuclear devices allowed for much more flexibility. Take the American B-61 freefall nuclear bomb. Depending on the model, the B-61 has a number of different possible yields, ranging from 0.3 of a kiloton to 400 kilotons. For example, the Mod 3 bomb reportedly has 4 yield settings: 0.3, 1.5, 10, and 170 kilotons. To change the yield, all an operator has to do is adjust the settings of the weapon highest emission. No internal components have to be replaced. Dialing yield works by deliberately causing the weapon to malfunction at different stages of the process, or in other words, by intentionally causing a fizzle. For the Mod 3 bomb, the full yield is 170 kilotons, but we can surmise that the 10 kiloton setting is simply the yield produced by the fission primary. By changing the internal geometry of the weapon, the secondary will not be properly compressed, preventing ignition. The lower settings are achieved by intentionally causing the primary to fizzle, either by not boosting the weapon or by varying the neutron reflectors and ignition timing to only generate a partial detonation. This allows for great flexibility in the utilization of a nuclear stockpile. A single weapon, such as the sub-1,000 pound B-61, can be used to strike many different kinds of targets which require different yields. This makes them useful in both the tactical and strategic roles. Most modern nuclear weapons include a variable yield function. Both the United States and Soviet Union invested heavily in tactical nuclear weapons, which made up a large portion of their massive 30,000 weapon plus stockpiles. Nevertheless, many have argued that even the smallest use of nuclear arms would inevitably result in total nuclear annihilation, meaning a tactical nuclear war is quite literally impossible. However, the inevitability, or not, of this proposition remains unsolved. Obviously, the employment of small-yield, tactical nuclear weapons against military targets poses a very significant risk of escalation to the strategic level. Nonetheless, like many things in history, perhaps we should not treat this kind of escalation as inevitable. Historically, there have been other norms that have held in war. During the Second World War, all of the major powers possessed vast chemical weapon stockpiles. By the development of nerve agents like sarin, Germany had achieved a technological lead, although Britain had large stockpiles of mustard gas. Despite the ability of both sides to use chemical weapons on enemy population centres, and despite the fact that all sides were engaged in a total war, one in which national survival was at stake, neither the Germans, nor the Western Allies, nor the Soviets employed these devastating weapons. Indeed, although there were instances of chemical weapon attacks on the Chinese, chemical weapons were not used in the Pacific Theatre either. Even though Japanese and German cities were being turned into rubble by Allied bombers, they still refrained from using this most terrible of weapons for fear of retaliation in kind. When it came to chemical weapons, a form of mutually assured destruction existed. This historical episode should guide us when we consider the employment of nuclear weapons. Clearly, if the major powers could refrain from employing chemical weapons in a total war, then we should conclude that it is at least possible for a war between NATO and the Soviet Union to have involved only a limited nuclear exchange. Certainly, both powers had to be prepared for that possibility, which is why they invested so heavily in low-yield tactical weapons. In many ways, the ballistic missile revolutionized the nuclear bomb, at least in the strategic role. Indeed, an evaluation of the nuclear weapon itself is incomplete without considering its method of delivery. After all, a 100 megaton hydrogen bomb is perfectly useless if it cannot be delivered to the target. Throughout the first decade of the nuclear age, the immense weight and size of nuclear weapons meant the heavy bomber was the only practical delivery system, giving the United States a significant advantage throughout the 1950s. Nonetheless, the Soviets were about to change the game. On the 12th of September 1960,